Aztec sexuality and their cultural attitudes toward it were fairly repressed. They maintained strict laws regarding intercourse, and any related actions outside of their concept of marriage were not only forbidden but were often cause for capital punishment. Despite this reluctance, sex work, one of the oldest and most widespread professions in the world, was common in Aztec culture. Their understanding of the practice was far different from that of the modern Western world. However, within Aztec society, such work was very ritualistic and, within those confines, accepted in mainstream culture. Conversely, homosexuality in the Aztec Empire was strictly prohibited and, despite being almost unheard of due to repressed attitudes, was an offense often resulting in capital punishment. Though many relevant sources on the topic of Aztec sexuality are unreviewed, the information that is available shares many prudish aspects of sex in the Aztec Empire. The Aztec civilization flourished from the 14th to 16th century. Living in what is now known as Mexico, the Aztecs had a small empire of city-states in the area around Mexico City. They were a Mesoamerican culture with many artistic and cultural achievements. While they are best known in popular culture for their vengeful deities and tradition of human sacrifice, the Aztecs had a rich culture that included distinct styles of painting, sculpture, and ceramics. An aspect of Aztec culture that is not often discussed is their repressive sexuality, which was downright Victorian in its prudishness. The Aztec Empire fell in the 16th century at the hand of Spanish and Portuguese conquistadors. Nevertheless, the Aztecs held deep beliefs when it came to sexuality. Aztecs had evil sex deities. The Aztecs had numerous deities, some of whom governed the realms of sex and vice. The gods who ruled over sexuality were often thought to bring misfortune and bad luck to any who prayed to them or angered them through their behavior. The Ahuehuetitio was a group of 5 deities who all oversaw the realm of sex, and all 5 were also associated with misfortune and disease. The connection to disease is particularly impressive with what we now know of sexually transmitted infections. Ixquiname and Chicomicoatl were 2 goddesses depicted as females who were associated with sin, lust, and infidelity. Given the Aztec tendency towards punishing only women for adultery, it is unsurprising that the gods of infidelity were depicted as women. Chicomecoatl was associated with sex, but even more strongly with childbirth and fertility. The name of the sex pantheon, Ahuehuetitio, actually gave rise to the Nahuatl, Aztec, word for prostitute, Ahuinime. Interestingly, it appears the word literally translated to bringer of joy, but colonial Catholics translated the word into more negative connotations and described the Aztec prostitutes as evil creatures. Given that so much of our knowledge of the Aztecs was written through a colonial Catholic lens, it is difficult to truly understand how the Aztecs themselves viewed the Ahuinime and Ahuehuetitio. Female sacrifices were given to the king as concubines. Female sacrifices suffered a more horrific fate. A woman acting as an avatar for the mother goddess, Tosai, would be handed over to the Tlatoani, roughly translated as king or ruler, as concubines prior to her execution. Her end was also gruesome. The priest impersonating Tosai in the sacrificial ceremony would flay and then wear her skin. Tosai, as presented in the iconography of the time, was often pictured as wearing human skin. Homosexuality was punishable by execution. Homosexuality was deeply despised in the Aztec Empire when it was acknowledged at all. The punishments were extraordinarily severe and cruel for anyone found to be engaging in homosexual activity. The Aztecs' response to homosexuality was particularly brutal. Some references claim that same-sex attraction may have been punished via impalement. Despite these views, references to cross-dressing boys, concubines, and their related duties hint toward a double standard in regard to ritualistic sex practices. It is interesting to note that receptive partners in homosexual relationships relieved an arguably crueler punishment. This concept mirrors Roman culture, where the penetrating partners were considered socially acceptable, but the receiving partners were looked on as effeminate and immoral. Aztecs had rigid expectations of masculinity and respected aggressive and macho behavior. Any behavior that would make a man behave or appear more like a woman would devalue his role in Aztec society. Masturbation often wrought burning consequences. Self-stimulation was considered unacceptable among the Aztecs. As Gary Jennings outlines in his book Aztec, those who were caught masturbating were punished by having ground chili peppers rubbed into their genitals. This punishment is starkly contrasted with some other cultures' practices. Some Native Americans purposefully rubbed hot peppers on their genitals to prolong pleasure during intercourse. It is not clear how strictly this prohibition was enforced, nor who was responsible for administering the punishment. One also wonders if it applied to both sexes, or if female masturbation was even acknowledged in Aztec culture. The active ingredient in chili peppers, capsaicin, causes burning and tingling sensations that can range from irritating to excruciating depending on the concentration of the chemical. Capsaicin can be refined and concentrated into a weaponized form, which is the active ingredient in pepper spray. Anyone who has rubbed their eye after chopping up a jalapeno pepper understands just how nasty this punishment could have been. Other indigenous cultures in North America, specifically some Native American tribes, used ground chili peppers to cause mild numbing to prolong sexual performance and enhance their enjoyment. It is said that some Spanish colonizers even tried this after learning of it, much to the judgment of the Catholic priests accompanying them on their voyages. Men could be executed for adultery. In the Aztec Empire, a staunchly patriarchal society, male sexuality was far less controlled than female sexuality. However, adultery was cause for execution, and a young man slipping away from school to have intercourse could be beaten, burned, and have his head shaved, though this may have been a punishment for the shirking his duties at the Telpoch Cali. For both the noble and common classes, marriages were typically arranged by an aratanza, or matchmaker, and both men and women were expected to abstain from sex prior to marriage. However, as men's virginity was more difficult to prove or disprove, presumably because the Aztecs relied on the presence of a woman's hymen, which can be torn without intercourse, young men often escaped the punishments that accompanied premarital sex. Polygyny was legal but reserved for nobility. Throughout history, there are countless examples of cultures in which powerful men were allowed to take myriad wives. Genghis Khan had over 50 wives. The Prophet Muhammad of Islam had several wives. The Aztec Empire followed suit, with mighty men allowed to take multiple wives. This method was the only form of polygamy tolerated by the Aztecs, with lower-class men and all women prohibited from having multiple partners or spouses. As with the cultures described above, the Aztecs typically recognized one wife as the true wife, afforded full status, while the additional wives were relegated to a status closer to that of a concubine. With Genghis Khan, he had one true wife whose children he recognized as his heirs, while the additional wives' children were not recognized as his true issue for inheritance purposes. While commoners were expected to be monogamous, rich men and nobles married many wives, though the secondary wives were considered concubines. In this sense, polygyny was accepted but was something reserved for the noble classes. Moctezuma, for example, had hundreds of wives. When Hernan Cortés invaded in 1519, polygyny offended his and his soldiers' Christian beliefs. By the 1600s, the Spanish conquerors converted virtually everyone to monogamy. In the Aztec Empire, having multiple wives was strongly associated with great wealth. Women were the exclusive weavers of cloth, which was highly prized and used as currency. A man with numerous weavers in his household would have a great deal more wealth than a lower-class man with only one weaving wife. The Aztec leader Moctezuma had hundreds of wives, all of whom would have been continuously generating wealth for his household. Women were encouraged to copulate throughout pregnancy. Both the common and noble classes employed a midwife, or tlamatl throughout a pregnancy. The Aztecs believed that a pregnancy was influenced by divine intervention. For instance, solar eclipses were thought capable of harming a pregnancy, as deities turned into monsters when the sun was covered. Because of this belief, pregnant women were kept indoors during these solar events. The Tlamatl would also encourage a pregnant woman to sleep with her husband up until the 7th month of pregnancy, because if she abstained entirely from the carnal act, the baby would be born sickly and weak. Concubines were forced into celibacy for several years after childbirth. While pregnant women were encouraged to engage in intercourse into their 3rd trimester, concubines in a nobleman's household were expected to be celibate following childbirth. Susan Toby Evans writes that a concubine would likely not copulate with her husband, a lord, for years following childbirth. While the children of secondary wives did not enjoy the same social status as the child of primary wives, they could achieve enormous power. Emperor Itzcoatl was fathered by the first Aztec emperor, Acamapictli, but sources claim his mother was either a slave woman or a peasant who sold vegetables in the public market. Women were gifted to Spanish conquerors. Aztec rulers were known to give women away to other high-ranking men as gifts. This practice continued even after Cortés invaded in Tenochtitlan in 1519, and it was unclear how the women felt about being given away as prizes. Muñoz Camargo, a Spanish chronicler, documented this practice, saying that Aztec rulers took absolutely whichever woman they wanted, and they were given to them as men of power. And, following this usage, many daughters of the rulers were given to the Spaniards, so that they would leave descendants there, in case they should go away from this land. When Cortés arrived, he and his men were given 20 women, including Malinali, or Malinche, a wealthy noble woman, who also served in a diplomatic capacity between the Aztecs and the Spaniards. Some women performed ritualistic intercourse. As the holy men behind historical Hispanic texts were products of a monogamous, patriarchal culture, most descriptions of sex workers in the Aztec Empire are heavily demeaning. These texts did, however, recognize that these Aztec women fulfilled an assigned ritualistic role in society. They were known as a Huionim, and they were associated with the goddess Xochiquetzal. In the Florentine Codex, Sahagun states the priestesses of Xochiquetzal would ritualistically offer themselves to young warriors after a battle. They were also trained in art and music and would entertain male sacrificial victims before they were ceremoniously slaughtered. Aztec Huionim were easily identifiable. Their appearance was purposefully different from that of the common Aztec woman. The latter would wear her hair up, as opposed to the loose hairstyles of the Huionim. Perfume, jewelry, and face paint similar to modern makeup were all staples of a Huionim attire. In the Florentine Codex, Sahagun also claims the Huionim would paint their teeth and habitually chew gum. Sahagun did, however, describe them as detestable and shameful creatures. While he acknowledged some of their ritualistic duties, he failed to fully understand the role they played in Aztec religion. Some deities related to vices and excess brought misfortune. The Aztecs had numerous deities, several of which were associated with sexuality and vices. Usually the deities that fell under this category were thought to bring misfortune. The Ahuyatitio were a group of 5 gods associated with vices and pleasure, but they were also thought to incite disease and bad luck. Quetzalteotl, a complex goddess who represented several aspects of Aztec life, was also known as the goddesses Ixquiname and Chicomicoatl, deities that symbolized sin and cheating. Quetzalteotl has also been categorized as a fertility goddess when in a childbirth position. She was later also confused with the mother of all gods, Tosai,